Welcome to All Things AI. In the 11th episode of the All Things AI podcast, we have Ganesh Mani, a distinguished professor of innovation practice at Carnegie Mellon University, whose work is centered around developing AI and more specifically providing effective advice for the responsible usage of AI technology. Welcome to the channel, and it's an honor to have you here today.
Ishan, I'm glad to be here. Wonderful to see all the youthful energy in you. Let's get started.
Yeah, perfect. And so it's late in the day, typically after working hours. So I was just wondering, how's your day going so far?
Yeah, these days it's work from home, right? So today, actually, most of my day was spent in my home office, this background, as opposed to the classic EDU educational background, which means didn't interact with too many students, but had a productive day. So thank you for asking.
Yeah, of course. And so I guess with that being said, we will move on to today's first portion, which is going to be focused around responsible AI. So just as a bit of a background for anyone watching this, recently President Biden launched an executive order on AI. Maybe I shouldn't say recently, about a month or so ago. And then after this happened, we actually saw that just days ago, the EU decided to launch a landmark AI bill that actually is also now focusing in on AI restrictions. But the thing with the EU is that it's more of something that's hardcore compared to, for example, what the United States released. So on that note, I was wondering what type of impact you believe that these two regulation guidelines will have on the development of AI, especially in the near future.
No, great question, Ishan. So one of the interesting things is I think, we've had in medical devices, the FDA approval, the CE mark in the EU. So the FDA approval tends to be a little more stringent. CE mark is a little more liberal in many cases. Here, it's the exact opposite, right? I think the US didn't really put in for any fines and so on. So lightweight registration requirements. It also seemed like it was more national security centric, maybe econ centric, i.e. economic value, economic development, while the EU portion seems to be more sort of human centric, if you will, more around really getting people to comply, and there are some fines. I think some of them are a certain percentage of revenues, right? I saw a range going into double digit in revenues, which can be significant for some large companies.
Yeah, so I think actually building off of this, that's what's going to transition into the next question. I think because the EU's guidelines take the form of a rule book, meaning if you don't do this, you'll get punished for it. So I think that really is going to have something of a different repercussion than, for example, the United States is, which appears to be at least on the front a bit more loose. So my question is, what impact do you think the lack of ambiguity is going to have? Or in other words, will this be beneficial or detrimental? The fact that it's like really rigid, especially for EU AI companies.
Yeah, so let me step back a little bit, right? Couple of philosophical things, right? One, I have kids who are growing up. I have a teenager at home as well. So sort of in family circles, I grew up hearing this, and I tell this to my kids. If you don't make good decisions, right, other folks, teachers, policemen or women, judges will make decisions on your behalf, right? And you typically don't want that, right? So there was a push, especially in more libertarian economies, for the self-regulation. There was a bit of that going on Wall Street as well, where I spent a lot of time. I think you need a little bit of both. I think you need some overarching top-down regulation, and some of that is sort of policies, mores. We have that, right? Like growing up, people sort of the elders tell you, and then you also observe certain things, and then there are some bottom-up things within your sort of friend group, or in your sort of startup or larger company. There are some mores, there are some customs, and so on. So I think having a bit of both is interesting, but I think getting the balance is difficult. I think most of the folks are talking about sort of risk-based control. Now, quantifying risk is tough. There are some folks who have talked about what are the ingredients, right? What's the data that goes into it? You shouldn't be using biometric data. That's one of the stringent things in the EU, unless there's an imminent terrorist attack or something like that, right? So, you have to get a judge's order in some cases and so on. So you could look at it based on inputs, based on use cases. If you can quantify risk, sort of this high risk, low risk, medium risk is good. But I was wondering, who draws those boundaries and so on.
Yeah. And I think really looking at it from a standpoint of businesses and their desire to profit, one thing I was thinking was if there's such strict regulations, is there really going to be an impact on how much money these companies are making? And I guess really tying this back into the United States, we saw that, and I actually did a video on this, like the last one I posted was like more of a news update than an interview. What I was talking about was how OpenAI and I guess Sam Altman's exit from OpenAI, that was brief because he's now back there, but really the fact that Sam Altman wanted to push AI, profit off of it, and that the board at OpenAI, which is obviously more nonprofit centric, didn't want that to happen. So my question here being, do you think that this is really going to affect the profits and revenues that certain companies are making? And will this come to their displeasure possibly?
Yeah, so some people, let me take the last one first and then I'll step back a little bit. I think on your last point, some people believe that the EU regulation actually sort of levels the playing field because they've sort of quantified things. Maybe the US current executive order is more friendly towards large companies, potentially, there's some lightweight registration, reporting requirements, and so on. I think what's important, you brought up OpenAI, right? So one of the early failures in OpenAI was there was no truth in labeling, right? I mean, OpenAI is really not open. So much like I think there are people who talk about coming up, much like for food we have, and that's regulated by the FDA, right? So you pick up something in your grocery store, you see all the ingredients, right? So I think there's an NYU professor. She's been, I think, Julia Stoyanovich or whatever. So she's been talking about this sort of data labels, ingredients, and so on. So likewise, you can say use cases, much like for drugs, we have sort of the normal use cases, and then physicians are allowed to do that off-label use as well, right? But then maybe, somebody needs to monitor that a bit more carefully and so on. So those are, I think it's tough. And I was going to make an earlier point, much like we saw with COVID, a lot of these things, you can't draw artificial boundaries, right? So especially with bits, we've seen that with the internet and people trying to block things based on IP addresses and then VPNs and so on. So maybe the EU regulation, by virtue of being sort of first mover, they may have some ability to make it sort of the standard, but I think it's going to be tough, right? We've had some issues with the GDPR and those sorts of things as well. So I think having a global standard, we got that a little bit with some of the internet communication protocols and email and some of the early internet digital infrastructure. So if you can get to more uniform infrastructure, that's still malleable because we'll know a lot more. I think we're getting more anxious about AI, climate change, while 2 or 3 wars are going on. There's one in Sudan that's not being talked about very much. I'd rather see people debating that because we need to be anxious about things that are imminently in front of us as opposed to some of these things that are 5, 10, 15 years out. So that's some side commentary as well.
Yeah. And I guess building off of this, we were talking about like kind of physicians, I guess, in your answer. So with physicians, obviously there's healthcare because that's a system that they're part of. I also noticed that you have a bit of a background with working in healthcare, really, and then the intersection of healthcare and AI. So specifically honing in on the startup field, which is perhaps maybe my favorite because even like OpenAI was a startup and it, I guess, still is in a way, even though it's like a major AI company now, especially before ChatGPT. It wasn't like the most well-known company per se, but after this, they've, I mean, hit a new landmark and they've set the bar for other AI companies. But Also, I've read the article that you forwarded earlier, and it opened me to the fact that there was like thousands of AI companies all competing with it, and OpenAI obviously ended up at the top of this. And then I guess before the interview, we were talking about like the company that you worked at with, I guess, with computer aided diagnosis. And so really basing it off of that, it's true that AI has been here for decades. And I think that's one of the most underappreciated part of this because like I've seen people in the 1980s talking about AI, like majors and things like that. And it's like I wasn't born back then. I was born like 20, 30 years after that. And then now, nearly 40 years after that, it's coming to light. So I think that's one of the most underappreciated parts. But I guess my question really focuses in on the healthcare industry and more specifically healthcare focused startups, because I think that's one area that we haven't seen much from yet. So, do you believe that we'll see a lot of healthcare focused AI startups emerge in the near future, especially in the next maybe 3 to 4 years? Because at least what I'm seeing is that most of these startups are currently focused on generative or even personalized AI.
No, good question, Ishan. I think one of the reasons why you're going to see a lot of healthcare innovation, forget AI, is because the US is one of the most inefficient markets with respect to healthcare, right? 20% of the GDP. Really, you need doctors, patients, maybe some technologists who are operating, if you will, the MRI equipment, imaging equipment, or maybe helping with now some of the AI instances and so on, right? But there are a lot of other middlemen, a lot of other processes that sort of occupy a bulk of that 20% of that GDP. That's sort of a shame. So I think innovators are sort of drawn to it. But because of FDA, because of some structural things, it is not a straight line to revenue. So there are a lot of VCs that don't actually fund medical AI startups. So I actually stumbled upon medical AI in the mid 90s. I was primarily in graduate school. I did AI, I did finance. We had a small student fund funded by the foundation at the University of Wisconsin. Um, so I did a fintech startup along with an ex Goldman gentleman. Wasn't called fintech then. Nobody was using neural nets for finance. We were one of the early people. And then one of my colleagues, his wife, she had done a very interesting image registration project as part of her PhD, registering the human breast, the female breast, 6 months apart or a year apart. And she said now, once it's been registered, and this was in the film world, right? So you need to scan the film, and mammograms were film-based. Can you look for abnormalities? So that was actually I was an advisor to that project and ended up being one of the really early FDA approved AI systems. I think at that time it wasn't even called AI, they called it computer aided diagnosis, but it went through the 510(k) process. And there was a lot of resistance from radiologists, there was a lot of resistance from the payers. And eventually, even when they got the reimbursement code, it was I was shocked that it was sort of $8 reimbursement for the second reader, and it had to work into the radiologist workflow and so on. So a lot of interesting lessons there. And now, obviously, especially in radiology, cardiology, et cetera, there are a number of FDA-approved systems. But I think of it as, human complement versus human replica, right? We can replicate humans in about 9 months, right? A couple of people get together and, you can replicate a human, but getting the right complement, right? So we all now have smartphones. The smartphone is an okay complement. So really clinicians should be thinking about not whether they can be replicated, but what can complement them, right? Much like why do we use a graphing calculator, right? Why do we use a calculator when somebody gives us maybe 2 4 digits, 4-digit numbers to multiply, right? So getting the complement right on the supply side of healthcare is very interesting. You could do a human replica now, creating a digital twin of me or you, right? And saying, hey, Ishan, if you do, you have mostly normal genes. There's this, slight risk here. But if you sort of take care of that, you will live up to 125 or 150, I hope, and so on, right? So that's very useful. So I say on the demand patient side of things, maybe digital twins, human replicas on the digital side are interesting. On the supply side of healthcare or any professional care, wealth management, teaching, I think a teacher's complement, a wealth manager's complement, a doctor's complement will be very interesting.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree because I've always heard things about like AI surgery, and I've even asked like past people that I've interviewed about this. What's the potential for AI getting itself involved in surgery? And then I think most answers were that it's like a long time away because obviously it can't replicate what a surgeon does. That's not what it's meant for. It's meant to like help the person, not to like replace them, I guess, in a way. But I think one place where area definitely has a potential is possibly building even off of generative AI that's already existent would be like personalized healthcare, obviously, because let's say someone has like a concern, even ChatGPT, because I've tested this myself, can address something if you have like healthcare concern. But I was wondering if we could develop AI potentially that can take this a notch further than just saying, hey, you should visit the doctor, and maybe even pair this personalized device up with, for example, like a computer aided diagnosis system. So what's the future looking like in terms of finding something like that?
No, again, going back to that analogy, right? You can have generative AI embedded in your digital twin on the patient side, which means that understands all of the things, including what the person likes and so on. Right now, my mother, who's 97, finally, my sister had to move her into a nursing home, and she has shifted places a couple of times, telling them she's vegetarian, she likes these sorts of foods, right? So that is something an agent could do, the digital twin of a geriatric patient or a young patient, right? Maybe a 4-year-old, 5-year-old who may not be able to provide the gamut of input, right? They always need a parent to sort of amplify to the dog. So all that can be done by an agent. Likewise, on the clinician side, the agent um, could be available 24/7, right? And then could um, speak slowly, could speak in the geriatric patient's native language. My mom understands English, Hindi, but her tongue is Tamil, right? So, when she's in pain, when somebody's speaking fast, maybe the Tamil version would be much more um, friendly, right? So those are the type of things I think your agent communicating with the caregiver's agent or the wealth manager's agent or an agent that's sort of looking out um, for Christmas is coming up, shopping, right? So you have your preferences. There may be an e-commerce agent that may be able to talk to your agent and say, hey, you wanted to take this trip or you wanted to buy this special lens or camera or whatever it might be. It's available on sale. And you can get it in 2 days or whatever, right? So those sorts of agent to agent interactions are going to become very interesting, and they'll be powered partly by generative AI.
Yeah. And think guess getting on from this and up until this point we were discussing like I guess what you think will be the future for AI, but now maybe looking into the past and your experience with AI. And the second portion of today's interview is going to be just your experience in AI. And so I really noticed that in your LinkedIn bio, you developed like AI architectures for State Street Global Advisors, I believe. And so like in this process of developing like AI architectures, models, neural networks, what part of the process do you think you most enjoyed?
Yeah, I'd say early innovation. We were actually very early with that startup that combined neural nets with asset management. We were using neural nets, we were using genetic algorithms. It wasn't deep learning, it wasn't fintech, but it had sort of this early, and the computers were slow, right? A lot of the um, speed ups, a lot of the wow factor we've gotten is because of the hardware speed ups, right? The NVIDIA chips, even the early victory here The chess software was developed at CMU, but then that group moved to IBM and converted Deep Thought to Deep Blue. And the big jump there was in terms of hardware, right? Hardware speed up. So we didn't have that. We were a little early, but we found that startup a good home at State Street Global, created the first research center there, serving multiple portfolio managers. But we were a little early, so I think the human experts didn't see the value. Maybe they thought it was trying to partly replace them or give them advice that they already knew about, and maybe there was a failure of messaging on our part, saying that this is a complement, this is augmentation, right? You can analyze maybe 10 stocks in a day by reading the reports. This allows you to now analyze 100 or 1,000 and, so on. So I think getting the workflow right, be it agent to agent or human to agent, the future is going to be multi-human, multi-machine teams, right? So how that team is architected is going to be, we already have, we say, oh, these two folks, don't put them on the same team. They're always at loggerheads, right? Or something like that. So I think creating the right uh, um, set of people, because some humans need arguments, some need stories to be convinced, some need hard data, right? So can your human counterparts or can your machine counterparts render things you need, information you need in that format and so on. So those are all going to be very interesting. So I think looking back, the sinusoidal nature of progress, I mean, that happens with any technology, is because of these two or three things. One, people had maybe very high expectations because the original founding fathers, right, like when McCarthy and Minsky and all that got together, I think it was 1956, right? They said, oh, we'll take maybe a summer to solve the vision problem and then another 3 months or 6 months to solve the robotics problem or whatever it is, right? And then we have found that even if I mean, I use the chess analogy. When the chess champion machine could play chess, I would be playing chess with my sort of nephews, nieces, or kids. And one of the things, if you're playing with a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, especially on a train or on an airplane, is you want to watch the chessboard so that the kid doesn't upset the chessboard, right? I mean, that's what you are as a human, as an adult, you're watching for. So a robot sort of sitting in that cramped space and playing um, gently with you, because there was this, I think a year ago, I read a chess playing robot almost crushed a youngster's finger or something like that. So, things like that. So, people talk about AGI, but if you really want robots doing a gamut of things, say in a nursing home or whatever, you want to make sure that the risk is controlled as well, right? So this goes back to not only the EU regulation, but how we design things so that we understand the risks, we plan for it, and so on. So I think progress was a little sinusoidal, but trending upwards, you could say, because of some of these factors that we just alluded to.
Yeah. And I think, I guess, considering that this was like kind of like not even like, I guess you could say fintech company on a sense, like wealth management. I think that's one of like my passions actually in the future in AI, more than like healthcare. I think the thing that most fascinates me with AI is its involvement in finance. But I guess building off of that, I'm sure you encountered challenges in your work because obviously, especially when you're developing this, I guess, startup. So my question here and the final question in this portion is going to be, what were the challenges that you typically encountered in your workflow, maybe even on a daily basis?
Yeah, so there are three broad spheres, right? Health, wealth, and wisdom. And I think what's going on is you need to be careful about having the right expectation with respect to how predictable is the domain or how predictable is the task, right? So in general, finance and economics, it's a weak theory domain, right? Say as opposed to Newtonian physics, right? So if I push this monitor here, the table still has a few inches behind it. So for the first uh, few inches of the drag, nothing is going to happen. And then the monitor is going to fall and I'm going to go off camera, right? So that's pretty well understood. But nobody knows. Even Colin Powell doesn't know um, if he cuts rates in the next couple of months or does nothing. What's going to happen to the markets? What's going to happen to the economy in 2024, right? A lot of the pundits you see on CNBC, they don't know. So that's a function of weak theory versus strong theory, but sometimes weak theories become domains, become strong theory domains, right? So before we talked about Newtonian physics, you could argue before Leibniz, Newton, wherever you think the inflection point was, um, things became well understood, right? Before that, physics wasn't well understood, especially the classical physics. So likewise, maybe there are some things with respect to the economy, with respect to biology, microbiome, how the mind and the body interact together, those sorts of things. So I think you want to, on the one hand, for an innovator, if you don't understand how the world works, and most people don't understand how that part of the world works, it's great, right? Because if you can come up with an innovation, look for white spaces, sort of turning them into green in the sense of green could be either impact or could be money, however you want to interpret it. That's cool, right? You've added value, but really think deeply about what data can you collect to make some things more predictable, and then what techniques you can bring. I think I sent you an article about India. I do some lecturing and thinking about AI and emerging economies. So you really want to, with respect to AI, there are really three pillars, right? One's the data, one's the domain knowledge. We just talked about it. What do you know about the domain? What is worth modeling? And third are the tools. Now, tools, everybody has access now to the open source tools. There's been a big revolution, not so much in LLMs, but in general with this, what I call, or what people call digital public infrastructure, right? GitHub, Wikipedia, now these open source LLMs, those are examples of it, i.e. these tools are now available to everybody, but still people can come up with private data. Your own data is private, you know your strengths and weaknesses. So you know what tasks to being self-aware, right? As you grow older, people talk about that. So I think the data and the domain knowledge needs to be personalized, regionalized, etc. Tools are now widely available, so that may, further give you some insights into how to combine this data, domain knowledge, and tools to come up with a successful AI deployment.
And so with that being said, we're gonna move on to the final portion of today's interview, which is going to be just advice for the younger generation. Obviously, you've experienced quite a little while with AI and everything in experiences, and I'm sure you have a lot of wisdom that you can offer to everyone watching this and myself also. So my first question in this portion will be, when did you initially recognize your passion for AI, and when did you decide to get involved? Because I know you were talking like even like 30 to 40 years back, you were getting involved. So I guess where did this really start?
Yeah, I think it may have been in high school. I read a book on robotics. Growing up in South India, there weren't actual robots. But even when I went to undergrad at IIT Mumbai, we actually used card input. Funny story, the ribbons would run out. So I actually, for a while, was able to put the card up to sunlight and read the Hollerith code for the job control language so that, we don't get the job kicked back. You were allowed one run for 24 hours. So you submit the card deck, you get your output back 24 hours later, and you didn't want to have a dud just because of the job control cards and so on. So we've come a long way. But then by my um, senior year, I think we got a Commodore 64 and then the Commodore 128 kilobytes came
Yeah.
around, and I was working with an ed tech. It wasn't called ed tech then, professor from MIT who was visiting Godrej, one of the larger companies in the in Mumbai. So yeah, look for innovation, look for white spaces, take on more risk, be curious, be passionate. I do some K-12 mentoring, and sometimes people ask me for projects. If I sort of carve off uh, a piece of what I'm already working on, I tend to find that people actually make less progress. While if the youngster has come to me, there was a young lady who a few years ago, nobody was talking about inflation. She came to me and said, I want to, I just mentioned her first name. Kate said, I want to work on inflation. I said, oh, rates are so low. Nobody's been talking about inflation. She had a good hunch and she did this human machine teaming. Not only did she build a model, she also polled in that cohort. There were other youngsters. So she built an interesting human machine teaming composite. And then was now is I think in her maybe second year at Stanford. It was very interesting that nobody else was talking about inflation. So sometimes youngsters sort of pick up on the trends. And remember, we're going to bequeath Earth to you, so we need to make sure you folks are more responsible and smarter than us. So I think our job is to kindle your passion, curiosity, and sense of responsibility.
Yeah, I totally agree with this. And then I guess really the last question, before I even get into the last question, I was just thinking about Gen Z while you were saying this. And it's like we're all so much into like technology, devices, everything, video games. And it's like, when are we ever going to come back and think about the holistic perspective of the future? Because like more than ever, I see like, especially Gen Z resorting to AI tools for their work. And it's like, it's surprising, I guess, in a way, because we're the ones that are supposed to take it to the next level when everything gets handed down. And then we're the ones that are probably the biggest users of it at the same time. So I just find that quite ironic. But really, I mean, after decades of experience and pondering upon your successes and maybe even sometimes shortcomings, what is one piece of advice that you'd like to leave with Gen Z as they venture into the world of AI? Possibly something that you wish your mentor told you maybe when you were back in high school or college.
Really be curious, it's lifelong learning, be a student of everything, right? I think I have another ex hostel mate of mine, who used the phrase, I think 10 years ago. He's been involved in many different fields as an economist by training after being an engineer. Um, he said, I'm just trying to figure out how the world works, right? So, figure out what can be improved after figuring out how it works. And, that's a good mission. And then this human machine teaming is going to be very important. So not only do we need to figure out how to team with other humans, how to team with different kinds of machines in the service of humanity.
Yeah, and I really think like keeping an open perspective is also like possibly something that I'm really going to take away from this and from your comments because my dad, for example, used to work in software and he ventured into medicine at like 35, 40 years old. So it's really shows me like that everything and anything will be possible. But I guess with that being said, thank you so much for being here today and taking the time out of your day.
Enjoyed it, Ishan. Good luck to you. I look forward to watching your career and listening to some of the other podcasts. It looks like you're off on a very good mission here. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And lastly, for anyone watching this, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and comment down below.